Thank you so much, Grace. I am thrilled to give this introduction to two such eminent contributors to the study and practice of care, mutual aid, and reproductive labor. First, Dr. Dean Spade will give the first presentation titled Mutual Aid for Survival and Mobilization. Dean Spade is an associate professor at the Seattle University School of Law. Dean has been working to build queer and trans liberation based in racial and economic justice for the past 2 decades. He's the author of Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law, the director of the documentary Pinkwashing Exposed, Seattle Fights Back, and the creator of the Mutual Aid Toolkit at bigdoorbrigade.com. His latest book, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, was published by Verso Press in October 2020. The second presentation will be given by Dr. Melanie Yazi, a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and is titled Ecologies of Indigenous Caretaking. Melanie K. Yazi is Assistant Professor of Native American Studies and American Studies at the University of New Mexico. She specializes in Navajo and American Indian history, political ecology, Indigenous feminisms, queer Indigenous studies, and theories of policing in the state. She also organizes with the Red Nation, a grassroots Native-run organization committed to the liberation of Indigenous people from colonialism and capitalism. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dean Spade and Melanie Yazi.
Thanks so much for the introductions. And so many thanks to the organizers of this conference. I know that it is a big labor of love to make this happen. And I was telling this to Rosie, but I've been going to this conference now and then since I was a law student at UCLA in the late 90s, and felt like it was one of the very important feminist interdisciplinary spaces that I found in the midst of those not very interdisciplinary studies that tend to happen in law school. So it's just really important space for me, and a true honor to be invited to be part of it today. So I'm just going to do like a little bit of how I see mutual aid basics, and introduce one kind of question that I've been being asked a lot since my book about this stuff came out, and then hope that helps generate this conversation. I'm so excited for Melanie's presentation too. So let me share some slides. Okay. So I'm just starting with this image that I really like from an artist named Roger Pete, that I just love that it says, "We are all we really have." I think in these moments of crisis that we're living in, these worsening crises on so many fronts, we can really feel that and the need for solidarity. So since this conference is happening at UCLA, I was thinking particularly about mutual aid in LA, and thinking about the work of Street Watch LA, which is a group that works at various sites throughout Los Angeles, supporting people living in encampments of unhoused people. And one of the things they do is that's a kind of classic mutual aid strategy. Like they give people tents and water and clothing, and they also have these power stations so that people can power their devices so they can communicate, which can be a really big difficulty for unhoused people. This is an image from January 2020, when Street Watch LA and other groups in LA became aware that the city was planning to raid the unhoused people's encampment in Echo Park. And so people put their bodies in front of the sanitation trucks that were coming to raid the camp and destroy it. And this worked. And for about a year, a little more than a year, people were able to live in Echo Park, and there was a lot of mutual aid happening there, power stations, people put in showers, people made, there was a lot of food, there was community gardening happening. And then of course, as I'm sure many of you know, in March of 2021, the city of Los Angeles spent over $1 million to have this very intense militarized police raid of the encampment, arrest people and destroy the encampment and put a fence around the entire 16-acre park that is Echo Park. I just wanted to lift this up in the beginning, because we're seeing this all over, right? Like we're seeing this combination of mutual aid that's like giving people things they need, helping people get groceries during COVID. Like people are doing so many amazing projects. And it also includes people defending each other from ICE and from the police, and literally like having these standoffs. There's also this other piece of this mutual aid, which is like getting between the police and and each other, and I just want to name that because I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this part of the bold mutual aid tactics that we need as all the crises we're living under, including, for example, the housing crisis worsens. So a couple background assumptions that, I mean, we can talk about them as much as you all want in the Q&A, but maybe they just help understand like where I'm coming from in a really short way. So I believe that social change comes from organizing by millions of people, not from charismatic leaders, corporate media coverage, elected officials, courts, or legislatures. And I think that needs to be said because the mythology of how social change happens in the US is that it comes from elites. And so if we think it comes from people power and not from elites, it changes what what all of our strategies are. And the point becomes, how can we get as many people as possible engaging with each other to survive and resist? I believe that local networked autonomous projects grounded in local knowledges and wisdom are better at responding to crises and building methods of collective self-determination. So instead of thinking like, we need to build one centralized thing that's going to run everything, which is kind of on the model of the nation state, what I see is that the best response to crises and creation of well-being for people and collective self-determination comes from lots and lots of local projects that are talking to each other and learning from each other instead of centralized with one sort of central authority. Again, that's kind of not the general assumption. Often what we think of organizations that have like a national scope as being more elite, right? That's kind of the tendency in our context. And I believe that starting with the survival of the most stigmatized people is the most pragmatic approach. And the reason that needs to be said is because we live in the context of like nonprofit and legal advocacy, where it's like, well, if we can get people to like immigrants who've never had contact with the criminal system and who are valedictorian and who don't have disabilities, then that's the way. You always like lift up those who are the least stigmatized in the group. And I think that usually wins very little for most people and often reifies the stigma. So I'm questioning why we're told that is pragmatic. I think it's actually not pragmatic. Okay, so hopefully that's useful. I'm happy to answer questions about those assumptions. So yeah, so my argument, in the book I put out recently and that I've been making for a long time is just basically that mutual aid is really essential part of social movements that kind of gets erased in the way that social change is narrated as being about elites. And that we need to pay more attention to like the central role that mutual aid has in building and social movements. Mutual aid is about providing material support to people to survive the existing systems, right? Based in an understanding that the problem is the systems, not the people in crisis. Like the crisis is not the fault of the people in crisis, it's the fault of the systems. And mutual aid is like providing material support with an invitation to collective action. So like, you're coming here because you are facing eviction and you want help with that. Yes, and also, would you like to be part of the organizing with other people who are facing eviction, or with other tenants, or with other people facing the housing crisis? Like kind of mutual aid where direct support is also an on-ramp to participation in movements. Not that you have to do that in order to get this help with your eviction, but also you're invited to this. That there's a politicization of the moment in which people seek support for survival conditions. And that's what mutual aid does that I think is so significant. It provides a way for people to politically participate that's based in care and action rather than symbolic statements or gestures. So it's not like, just like the system loves for us to wait to vote, to give money to nonprofits occasionally, to volunteer at something once a year, and to, put stuff on social media. Like if that's the limit of our participation, that's very comfortable for the system. It's a very passive kind of way. Whereas when we actually start like getting our hands dirty with each other and like really supporting each other's survival and networking and solving our own problems and responding to our own crises, that becomes much more threatening. That's building a different kind of world. And that's what mutual aid does. And it actually builds safety, which will never be delivered by the systems that promise us safety, like the colonial border system or policing system. And also mutual aid is really important because we're anticipating a lot more disasters, like the next fire season and the next hurricane season and the next blackout, and so we need to prepare for disasters. And when we know people, when we know each other, when we've practiced sharing stuff, when we've practiced dealing with conflict, when we've practiced working in groups, making decisions together, we are more ready for the next disasters. I often think about a friend of mine who lives in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and in a big apartment complex that's got 2 large buildings. And she felt so strongly when Hurricane Maria struck that the skill she needed most was how to call a meeting with all of her neighbors. People were totally helping each other and supporting the elders, and who couldn't get, downstairs because the elevators were broken, and people were doing a lot for each other. But the thing she wanted was like, I want to be able to call that meeting and know I know how to facilitate it, right? Like that's the disaster preparedness she wants for the next storm. Key important thing about mutual aid, it's not charity, it's distinguished from charity. Charity is a model that's about celebrating rich people's generosity, right? It's like the version we see a lot in the narrative in the US is like really based in like, old European Christian traditions of like rich people give alms to the poor to buy their way into heaven. Like it's about it's not about like ending wealth and poverty. It's just about rich people like, kicking down crumbs that don't really affect them very much in order to like these days like get good PR. And charity models are all about saving and blaming and controlling poor people. So it's like, you could get on the list for housing if you can show us that you're sober and you're taking the psych meds we want, and you go to these 16 meetings with your parole officer, and you're like this kind of like idea that the people who are in crisis are to blame, and that they have something morally wrong with them or behaviorally wrong with them, and that they need these social workers or these government institutions or nonprofits to intervene upon them to make them worthy. For that reason, charity is often about identifying who the deserving poor are. So like charity is characterized by a lot of eligibility criteria. Like you can only get this if you have these statuses, if you take these urine tests, if you, have kids, if you don't have kids, if you, whatever it is, if you're a Christian, if you're whatever. And so trying to figure out like who gets these few crumbs is all about reifying the idea that there are undeserving people, that people, deserve to be homeless or deserve to be poor. And ultimately, the charity model is system sustaining. It's not in any way aimed at getting rid of the fact that of the crises, getting rid of the fact that people are unhoused, getting rid of the fact that people are, don't have healthcare, et cetera. Mutual aid is, I think the opposite, right? It's the idea is that the system, not the people suffering under it, is what creates poverty, crisis, and vulnerability. Mutual aid centers how the system put them in this situation. They don't need like outsiders who are elites saying like, this is what's wrong with you, this is what you need, this is the medicine you need to take, and this is the other medicine you're not allowed to take. Mutual aid projects tend to be based on a long-term commitment instead of I'm going to volunteer once a year at the soup kitchen. It's we're going to start this childcare collective and figure out how to do childcare for people who want to go to these political meetings, and we're going to dig in and we're going to learn stuff together, and we're going to provide this over time, or this jail support collective, or this prison letter writing project, or whatever it is. A lot of mutual aid projects focus on open meetings and pathways for new people to join, because as I mentioned, maybe I didn't, the mutual aid is the key way people come into social movements, either because they need something and these people are providing it, and then they get contact with people who are like, hey, do you want to be part of this collective action? And they get to build community instead of being stigmatized and isolated in that experience of crisis, or because people are like, I'm so mad about what's happening, I want to make change, I want to help people, and they join. And so that, I was in that situation before, and now I want to help other people who are in it, or whatever the case may be. So open meetings are key, like having a way to be welcoming and to have more people be able to come in, because we need a lot of people, because there's a lot of crisis going on. And that, this isn't always true. If you're doing work that's secure, like if you're doing something to support people that is illegal, you're going to, of course, maybe not have open meetings, but for most kinds of mutual aid, open meetings are useful and essential for keeping it from being like 5 people doing it and burning out. Mutual aid has inherent in it political education, right? Like you get into the group, and inevitably you've come and you have some idea like, I want to help children at the border, but you get there and you're like, oh, I actually care about adults too. And wow, I never really thought about specifically the ways that immigrants with disabilities experience this system, or, you inevitably expand. And so political education is kind of inherent to doing the work. And also most mutual aid groups do political education work, like let's study the genealogy of work like ours, or let's talk about disability justice together, or let's think about together like how we can make our meetings feel more welcoming to this group, that kind of thing. There's also a lot, I realize I'm running out of time, there's a lot of, sort of pieces of this that are about the processes themselves, right? Like people, in order to do this work together, most mutual aid work is entirely volunteer. And so we need to learn a set of skills we don't tend to have in this society, including the ability to give and receive feedback, which is very difficult in a society in which we dispose of people and throw them away, and where everyone's terrified of being wrong. So learning these kinds of skills, and that's a lot of times mutual aid groups do workshops on these kinds of things, right? On how do we have conflict resolution? How do we talk to each other about our concerns before we blow up at each other? How do we build transparency in the work and make sure that everyone knows if there's money coming in, where it's going and coming, and how decisions are made? And a lot of groups, I think increasingly over the last several decades, there's been a move towards more and more consensus-based decision-making rather than majority rule. We don't actually want to outvote each other. We don't want to be like, I got 7 other people in this meeting to say that they all think it should happen on Tuesday too, so now we won. It's like, no, we actually want to find out if there's a reason it shouldn't happen on Tuesday, so that everybody comes and keeps coming, because we're all just here as volunteers. So like, it's a very different skill than the one that we're used to in a society in which most of our spaces are coercive, like you're being paid to be there, or you are getting grades or whatever. It's different to actually desire to hear people disagree with you, so that you can come up with a better, wiser answer together, which is a pretty like big skill set. Last question I just wanted to pose. I mean, the thing people ask me about the most since the book came out is like, what are you saying about, like, don't we need the government to provide us with social services and disaster relief? And my general thoughts, and I'd love to talk about this more, my very general thoughts about that are, one, I think there's a pretty intense fantasy that especially like liberals have, but also other people, it's a surprising number of people, about a caregiving state, about like that the US could become a place that like gives out care in a good way. And I, as somebody who spent my life studying social welfare systems in the US and disaster relief systems, and also who's been someone living on those, that's very hard for me to comprehend. Like, the US is a settler colonial white supremacist heteropatriarchal project, and all of the disaster relief and poor relief that it's ever given, that's my alarm, that it's ever put out has been aimed at those things. It's about cultivating white settler life. It's always been excluding a certain sets of people and promoting others. We can see that even with the recent COVID relief, like, you can't get it if you're undocumented, you can't get it if you work in criminalized work. It's delivered through PPP loans to small businesses. I mean, just like everything about it is about, it doesn't go to businesses owned by people of color. I mean, we see it again and again with each kind of disaster relief and poor relief. And so I don't have any reason to believe that there's going to be some like really awesome, not racist, neutral US disaster or poor relief. The other piece of that is people are like, but how can we go to scale? And I think that that's why I was talking about networked autonomous projects. Like, it's a different way of thinking about scale. It's not scale in terms of like, could we just find a way for the nation state, which is just like so hard for me to feel invested in, particularly when we're talking about the genocidal project of the US nation state, to like redistribute things right. Instead, it's like, no, what would it look like if people actually built local autonomous collective self-determination over the conditions of work, of energy, of that was really rooted in solidarity. So I'm happy to talk about this more. I realize this might seem vague to people if it's new, but finally, I just want to say, it doesn't mean we don't anticipate concessions, right? Like, yes, it is a big deal when our movements rise up and then the government kicks down some concessions. We can be like, wow, that's a sign that our uprising was meaningful. But we also have to remember, they just take it back as soon as your uprising is over, or as soon as they think that they can get away with it. So it's not, the concessions are not the goal, right? Like, and so we can fight for individual people's welfare or social security benefits, and we can, we can push to defund the police and have the money put into housing in our cities or whatever, but not with a kind of, I think, naive belief that like those government sources are going to become like not racist or not colonial, but instead that's a part of our ultimate struggle of building the conditions under which we have meaningful collective self-determination. So I'll leave that big question there. Thank you so much.
Hi, can you folks hear me? Cool. Thanks for that, Dean. I taught a politics of care graduate seminar. I have appointments in Native American studies and American studies here at the University of New Mexico, and we read Dean's book about a month ago and had a really great discussion about it. I really appreciate all the points you just made. Really looking forward to being in conversation about it. So yat shik do shidna Melanie Yazi nisha Bilagana nishlema and deshkijni bashis chin Bilagana dasha chirot hotsoni dashamela. So I'm going to set my timer to make sure I don't go over time. So I just introduced myself in Navajo, greeted you all as relatives, which for me is part of the ethics of caretaking I talk a lot about. I'm going to do something a bit different than what Dean just did. I'm going to read some passages from a book that I co-authored that just came out last week called The Red Deal, about 20 different people, mostly all Indigenous people, but mostly folks from the Red Nation wrote this book. But I actually am the person who authored the passages and the vignettes about caretaking. You know, I think a lot about caretaking. I'm very passionate about caretaking as a form of political praxis in movement spaces, but also caretaking as something that we can expand. You know, Dean talked about scale, caretaking as a form of labor, thinking through issues of infrastructure and political economy, and thinking about it at lots of different levels, kind of working in synchrony with one another, I think, to really develop the kind of revolution, you know, and the transformative change that we want to see. So I'm just going to get into it so I don't go too far over time. So I'm just going to read 4 different vignettes from the book about caretaking, and then I'll be able to talk a bit more extemporaneously during our conversation. So in 2019, the mainstream environmental movement, largely dominated by middle and upper class liberals of the global north, adopted as its symbolic leader a teenage Swedish girl who crossed the Atlantic in a boat to the Americas. But we have our own heroes. Water protectors at Standing Rock ushered in a new era of militant land defense. They are the bellwethers of our generation. The year of the water protector, 2016, was also the hottest year on record and sparked a different kind of climate justice movement. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, herself a water protector, began her successful bid for Congress while in the prayer camps at Standing Rock. With Senator Ed Markey, she proposed a Green New Deal in 2019. Standing Rock, however, was part of a constellation of Indigenous-led uprisings across North America and the US-occupied Pacific. Doda Desert Rock in 2006, Unistoten Camp in 2010, Keystone XL in 2011, Idle No More in 2012, Trans Mountain in 2013, Enbridge Line 3 in 2014, Protect Mauna Kea in 2014, Save Oak Flat in 2015, Nihikalbe Iina in 2015, Bayou Bridge in 2017, Autumn Anti-Border Collective in 2019, Kumeyaay Defense Against the Wall in 2020, and 1492 Land Back Lane of 2020, among many more. Each movement rises against colonial and capitalist and corporate extractive projects. But what's often downplayed is the revolutionary potency of what Indigenous resistance stands for: caretaking and creating just relations between human and other than human worlds on a planet thoroughly devastated by capitalism. The image of the water protector and the slogan, "Water is life," are catalysts of this generation's climate justice movement. Both are political projects or political positions grounded in decolonization, a project that isn't exclusively about the Indigenous. Anyone who walked through the gates of prayer camps at Standing Rock, regardless of whether they were Indigenous or not, became a water protector. Each carried the embers of that revolutionary potential back to their home communities. Water protectors were on the front lines of distributing mutual aid to communities in need throughout the pandemic. Water protectors were in the streets of Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis, Albuquerque, and many other cities in the summer of 2020 as police stations burned and monuments to genocide fell. The state responds to water protectors, those who care for and defend life, with an endless barrage of batons, felonies, shackles, and chemical weapons. If they weren't before, our eyes are now open. The police and the military, driven by settler and imperialist rage, are holding back the climate justice movement. So here's the second one. It's titled A Caretaking Economy. A new green economy is the antithesis of what currently exists, a militarized extractive economy, what Lakotas call Owasichu Owe, the fat taker, the colonizer, the capitalist economy, or what activist Winona LaDuke calls Waitiko, the cannibal economy. If prisons, police, and the military are the caretakers of violence and agents of death, then educators, healthcare workers, counselors, water protectors, and land defenders are caretakers of peace and agents of life. A green economy should be born from and center the labor and needs of caretakers. Indigenous people, for example, are already working green jobs. They're just not getting paid or enjoying the protections employment offers for land, water, and treaty defense. Caretaking is often unrecognized work that is heavily gendered, severely criminalized, and never fairly compensated. The pay gaps between carceral and military workers, mostly men, and care workers, mostly women, makes this crystal clear. The climate justice movement needs to center the labor struggle of caretakers if it is to be successful. Caretakers can be powerful authors of a new economic system to replace capitalism with a caretaking economy. This caretaking economy is already in place. 3/4 of land-based environments and 2/3 of marine environments have been affected by capitalist development. But environmental degradation has been less severe in places managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. While making up only 5% of the world's population, Indigenous peoples protect 80% of its biodiversity. Indigenous peoples and local communities who have distinct cultural and social ties to ancestral homelands and bioregions still caretake at least 1/4 of the world's land. This includes places that are the lungs of the world, such as the Amazon rainforest and its veins, like the Missouri River Basin, areas facing existential threats of deforestation, damming, water contamination, oil and gas development, and mining. Indigenous people protect the land, air, and water we all need to live. In the United States, Indigenous caretakers have been the most confrontational arm of the environmental movement by blocking the construction of extractive infrastructure. They have therefore also been the most heavily targeted and criminalized. Following the Standing Rock protests, 8 states passed American Legislative Council inspired critical infrastructure laws criminalizing the protesting of oil pipelines. Legislation pushed by the Trump administration made inhibiting the operation of an oil pipeline, such as simply standing in the way of construction, an offense punishable by 20 years in prison. Water protectors and land defenders are the new generation of political prisoners. So caretakers are the new generation of political prisoners. South Dakota's next generation model legislation, which was drafted by Republican Governor Kristi Noem in collaboration with the Keystone XL parent company, TC Energy Corporation, goes even further than the ALEC model. Although overturned, it attempted to create new civil penalties for riot boosting, which include anyone who directs, advises, encourages, or solicits other persons participating in the riot. The goal is simple: to chill resistance by criminalizing water protectors fighting an oil pipeline trespassing illegally through their treaty territory. The intense criminalization of caretaking reveals the extent to which the ruling class will go to protect its interests and keep capitalism in place. If we're going to have any chance at defeating the fossil fuel energy industry and preserving the earth, which keeps us alive, the decriminalization of caretakers and caretaking labor, and Indigenous caretakers in particular, must be a fundamental priority. So here's the third one. There is no hope for restoring the planet's fragile and dying ecosystems without Indigenous liberation. This is not an exaggeration. It's the simple truth. Indigenous people understand the choice that confronts us: decolonization or extinction. We have unequivocally renewed our bonds with the earth, implementing Indigenous intellectual traditions in our movements for decolonization. There is no turning back. These bonds are sacred and will never be broken. This is why Indigenous water protectors and land defenders throughout the world are criminalized and assassinated on a daily basis. We have chosen life, and therefore we have been marked for death. Despite this grim reality, Indigenous people continue to caretake the land, even under threat of daily attack. The labor that Indigenous water protectors, land defenders, and treaty defenders perform is crucial to our species. We depend upon caretakers for both social and biological reproduction. Humanity would not exist without caretakers, but caretaking is labor. It takes work to plant crops. It takes work to hunt. It takes work to raise children. It takes work to clean homes. It takes work to break down a buffalo. It takes work to learn the properties of medicines. Healing the planet is ultimately about creating infrastructures of care, that will replace infrastructures of capitalism. Capitalism is contrary to life. Caretaking promotes life. Caretaking is at the center of contemporary Indigenous movements for decolonization and liberation. We therefore look to these movements for guidance on building infrastructures of caretaking that have the potential to produce caretaking economies and caretaking jobs now and in the future. We also look to the infrastructure of caretaking that is currently emerging where capitalist nation states have failed to save lives from COVID-19. Under the current system of global capitalism, caretaking is undervalued and often unrecognized as a form of labor. Caretakers like parents, land defenders, water protectors make up a huge percentage of workers who produce the social and material means by which we live, yet they are not paid. In a world being reshaped by a pandemic, caretakers have been the most important sector of workers, not only by saving people's lives, but also keeping whole families and communities afloat. Mutual aid networks populated by caretakers are proliferating, providing relief to the most vulnerable and paving the way for robust caretaking economies to replace the crumbling system of global capitalism. Current mutual aid networks are neither state-sanctioned nor state-funded efforts. They are entirely people-led, and the result of solidarity between nurses, service providers, students, domestic workers, migrant farmers, and families. Mutual aid networks affirm life by caretaking for humanity rather than denying life by abandoning and exploiting humanity. The monumental challenge we face is how to turn caretaking labor into life-affirming mass movements that can topple global capitalism once and for all, once the emergency conditions of the pandemic lift. Only when we are able to mount a real threat to the hegemony of global capitalism through such movements will we be able to heal the planet. Like the development of mass movements, affirming our relationship with the land is not optional if we wish to avoid extinction. This is not some mystical vision where we go out and hug trees. It is a serious agenda for decolonization that requires comprehensive land return programs and funding for mass Indigenous-led land restoration projects. Healthy reciprocity with the environment also depends upon Indigenous people having unrestricted access to land, unencumbered by colonial borders and free of harassment from agents of the state. We understand the land is our means of production as Indigenous people. This is why decolonization and land return are not metaphors. Land is also the means of production for settler economies, which require property as a basic building block for amassing capital and power. We cannot successfully wage class war until Indigenous land repatriation is taken seriously as a precursor to seizing the means of production more broadly. US imperialism, the greatest threat to the future of the planet, will never end if land remains in the hands of settler capitalists. The collective future of us all depends upon the ability of Indigenous caretakers to work with the land, restore its health, and reestablish balance in our relations. And I think I have about 1 minute left. Let me see if I can read one more little passage. Okay, I'll just read one more paragraph and then I'll wrap up. The critical infrastructure of Indigenous worlds is fundamentally about responsibility and about being a good relative. But our responsibilities do not happen only in the realm of political transformation. Caretaking, which we address, in the passages that I just read, is the basis too for vibrant economies that must work fluidly with political structures to reinforce the world we seek to build beyond capitalism. We must thus have faith in our own forms of Indigenous political economy, the critical infrastructures of caretaking. We must rigorously study, theorize, enact, and experiment with these forms. While it covers ambitious terrain, the Red Deal is at its base a program, right, for this type of study, theorization, action, and experimentation. But we must do the work. And the cold hard truth is that we must not only be willing to do the work on a small scale wherever it suits us, in our own lives, in our families, or even in the Red Nation, but we must be willing, as our fierceless Wet'suwet'en relatives have done at Unistoten camp, to enforce these orders at multiple scales. And so we talk a bit more about treaties, infrastructures of caretaking versus extractive infrastructures that have come out of Indigenous movements. But I'm going to stop there because I think hope I gave folks a lot of food for thought. I really look forward to being in conversation with you, Dean. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dean and Melanie, for your wonderful presentations. And thank you everyone for being here in the audience. I'm Rosie Stockton, the Thinking Gender Coordinator, and I'm so grateful to be here for this conversation. So we're going to move into a conversation between Dean and Melanie, and Catherine, Feliz, and myself will moderate this conversation, and then we'll open it up for audience questions at the end. So first, I'm delighted to introduce Catherine. Catherine Feliz is an interdisciplinary artist and medicine person born and raised in Lenape Territory, New York City, to parents from Quisqueya, Haiti, Dominican Republic. An entanglement with archival research, disarming apparatuses of violence, and earth-based healing inform their practice. They work to reclaim ancestral technologies that have systematically erased by drawing from multiple disciplines to unearth histories and make space for decolonial futures. Catherine is currently an MFA candidate at the University of California, Los Angeles, Department of Interdisciplinary Studio. You might also know Catherine as the medicine maker behind Botanica Cimarron, the co-founder of Abuela Taught Me, an Afro-Taino two-spirit educational space, and a founding member of Homecoming, a QT BIPOC radical care collective. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Catherine, to start us off.
Thank you, Rosie, for the introduction. And thank you, Dean and Melanie, for all that you've shared with us already. It's truly an honor to be in space with you today. The first question that I have is around burnout. My first introduction to mutual aid happened as a child when I would watch my mother share our extra food pantry meals with neighbors. And then this last spring, while organizing with herbal mutual aid projects that emerged alongside the protests to defund and abolish the police, this beautiful thing happened where, and I quote Dean, quote, "their work that is less visible and less valued," end quote, was suddenly loudly in the awareness of a new generation catalyzed by the radical possibility of mutual aid to imagine new ways of living. At the same time, our burnout made it painfully obvious that we are surviving under capitalism even as we resist. So my question is, how do we allow for and support the messiness, experimentation, and imagination to unfold as we continue to heal and, I quote Melanie, quote, extraction beyond relationality, extraction-based relationality, end quote, and dream in decoloniality as we widen our capacity for sustainable large-scale mutual aid systems of care.
Do you want to start, Melanie, or do you want me to start? Okay. Yeah, I think this is a big question. I mean, a couple of things. Like one is, yeah, one of the biggest ways we can fight burnout is recruit more people. You know, like that's really a thing. And like we need to be real about how we're not good at it. Like we're like, you know, you came in here and you didn't say the right words the first time you showed up, so now we're gonna ice you out, or we're not very friendly, or, you know, like just really a deep missing skill for a lot of people in our world is like we just are really into being right, which it makes sense as a response to the conditions we're living under, but that's not as helpful as being welcoming, you know? So that's big. We need more people. And we need to figure out how to build groups that can keep people who show up. So like how to be continually welcoming and how to deal with conflict. And for me, I think people mean a lot of different things by burnout. A lot of people I know who identify as having burned out in movement work actually had terrible toxic conflict, and that's why they left. So I think that it's like, we can, like, people can do a lot of work together and it's not always as exhausting. It's like, well, oftentimes the feeling that like, I can't get out of bed, I'm so in so much pain over this, is because I felt deeply misunderstood. I had a belonging wound with other people in the group. You know, we fell apart in a way that hurt. So a lot of this to me is the conflict resolution feedback skills stuff. Like the more we can build up our capacity to be together in ways that are that meet our deep social needs for belonging and to be heard, all of that feels like reducing the toxicity. I think then we might get tired and need to rest and have enough of us so that we can rest, which is different than burnout. Like I have got to get the fuck out of here. I hate everybody, or I'm so wounded by what happened. And then the other thing I'll say that is really meaningful to me around this is I think we have to really change how we experience the concept of work. So we learned what work is in like capitalism and the school work, like all these coercive, like if you don't do this fast, you're going to basically be left behind and die. And so we kind of bring that feeling, that embodied experience to our activist work often. And to my experience, that has been like feeling really obligated and like resentful really easily, or working in a way where I'm so tense and I'm so outcome oriented and like so insecure while doing the work, then it's much more draining and toxic for me. So what I've been thinking about is most of the work I do in movements, of course, I mean, all the work I do in movements is like unpaid. I'm choosing to do it. How can I feel like I'm choosing it and feel that on purpose and kind of wrest it away from my habit that, of course, I got from living under capitalism of thinking all things that are work are like obligations that I should resent and resist. Like, it's like I think there's an emotional dynamic. Like we live in a situation where we're supposed to like go to work at a job all day and like numb out because we're being exploited and it sucks, and like either be dominated or dominate others. And then we go home and like numb out with like high quality entertainment. Meanwhile, the world's on fire. How do I get out of that emotional binary? And so that I can be like, yep, I'm filling out a spreadsheet right now with Rosie for California Coalition for Women Prisoners. And it's a spreadsheet, but like, wow, Rosie and I believe in the same thing and we're here on purpose. Like, how can I orient? So for me, that's been a lot of my practice, especially for the last 10 years, is just like, how can I remember why I'm choosing this and look for sensations of belonging and accompaniment and pleasure, even when I'm doing like ordinary stuff. Cause like, you know, you got to change the diapers, you got to deliver the groceries. Like this is mutual aid work. It's, you know, it's really ordinary, beautiful. I mean, as Melanie just showed us so beautifully, like world-saving, life-giving stuff. And so I think I'm curious about that. And I think relatedly, a lot of people I know are really, really, really addicted to our current, sorry if that's not the right word for people, have a very compulsive or not chosen relationship to our current entertainment technologies, and they're very draining. And so the other thing is, how do I sort out for myself what's the difference between like a resilience activity I can do where I feel rested or I feel more connected and open and aware of what I believe in and a sense of belonging afterwards versus numbing. And that's, there's no judgment. We all do numbing escapist stuff because we're living under horrible conditions. But for me, that's been the other thing. Like, how do I figure out how to restore myself? And that means talking to other people in my community about what they're trying, and like really some of that's collective work. I think that's the other piece around burnout is like, what am I doing with the different parts of my day? Because all of the movements that have ever existed for resistance have all been done by a bunch of unpaid people. So it's not, and who were like living in extreme poverty under colonialism. So it's not like, this is too hard and we all have to get paid for it. That's just not an option. You know, the rich people are not going to pay us to destroy them. So we have to, you know, figure out what's going on that's draining us so bad. And I think it is this combination of conflict, not actually having quality rest and restoration, and being stuck in these psychic silos that were given to us by the systems we're living under.
Yeah, agree with everything Dean just said, really reiterating that like recruiting people, but not like in a creepy predatory way, which some organizations do, but you know, in a genuine way where you're like, you know, our people need material goods, right? They need homes, we need to feed them, and not out of a sense of charity, but I think the way the Red Nation operates, since we're an Indigenous-led organization, it's just what we do as Indigenous people, right? It's the notions of kinship and caretaking that are built into kind of our forms of law and governance and our kinship networks, me as a Navajo person, right? That it's, you know, it's considered like a shame on the community if someone is hungry, right? Or if a child is not taken care of, or someone doesn't have a home, right? And those things didn't exist before capitalism and colonialism completely destroyed, you know, those kinds of infrastructures that we used to live according to. And so, like, you know, Dean, you were talking about how mutual aid is such an important way. And it's just like a genuine kind of people level way to bring people into movements, right? And I think that's actually been our experience for the most part in the Red Nation. We have a lot of different kinds of people who come into the organization, but I would say it's our relatives who are living like in the most precarious social and economic conditions. People who are recovering addicts, for example, or current addicts, right, entering the organization, who end up actually embracing the politicization most because their lives are already very political and they already have a very strong understanding of colonialism, right, and white supremacy through encounters with the cops, for example, or being denied housing, you know, because of the intense racism that Native people face. So getting more people in to the movement, but I think people who, not necessarily working class people, although those folks are really important, but like the racialized poor, I would say, and spending a bit more time on how we do that, I think is really helpful for distributing labor in the movement, so that not like a single person becomes like the martyr who then gets incredibly resentful, I think, for having to take on too much responsibility. I'll also say something that's really, you know, difficult, I would say, about organizing, and I think is related to burnout, is that I would say the most consistent thing I experience, because organizing is about relationships, right? It's about working with people. Like you can't get around that. Like a movement is something that's populated by a whole ton of people, and people are messy and complicated, you know, and coming from lots of different directions. And the most consistent thing I have found in organizing is actually conflict. Cooperation is common, but conflict is more common, I would say. And I think that, you know, Dean, you were talking about uh, like social media, I think really exacerbates conflict. And so how we handle conflict internally within organizations or movements or collectives, you know, however we're self-organizing ourselves to do the work, is really important. Trying to find processes that work. But the thing is like some of them work, and then the ones that work for one conflict don't work for others. And so I find that the burnout actually happens with like the constant management or like the response to conflict. And what's interesting about the conflict is that sometimes that conflict is really important, right? And it'll take you to a different place, not just with yourself, but with the struggle or with your political development, for example. But sometimes the conflict is just destructive. And it's really hard, I think, to decide as you're facing each conflict, and sometimes you're facing multiple conflicts at multiple scales at the same time, how to choose, right? Where you're like, okay, so this is a call for accountability where I really need to confront this in a particular way, versus like, oh, this person's being racist. Like, I'm not going to respond to them. But I think that having skills and developing skills through having mechanisms for that in your organizing structure and in the political principles, and then also the way that you relate to people, particularly let's say in like your group, I think is really helpful for, you know, just managing the constant conflict that happens simply because you're working across a lot of differences. If you're dedicated to working across difference, which I think we need to do in order to build movements. But then also when you're just working with people coming from vastly different backgrounds. And lastly, I just did bring up social media, but I find that people get into such mean-spirited, hostile conflict, and there's so much misunderstanding and purposeful distortion between people who otherwise, I think, maybe have good intentions as progressives or radicals of various kinds, people who are really dedicated, genuinely dedicated to transformative change, and it just destroys people. I see those conflicts on social media in the movement destroy people. And I myself have participated in them in the past. And then I got a scolding from some like movement elders, and they're like, hey, you know, maybe you should stop acting this way, because there's so much currency in acting that way on social media. And so I find that unlearning some of those habits from this generation of organizers has been incredibly helpful for me, not to feel terrible about myself all the time, not to be terrible to other people, to try to actually work things out through relationship building with people, which I'm not really sure how social media facilitates relationship building. It's still kind of an open-ended question for me. But yeah, after, you know, I've been the subject of like doxing and like lots of terrible online behavior, and it's so common. to create an anonymous account and to bully people. Even like principled activists do this to each other. And I would really recommend that folks maybe spend less time on social media. I think it'll help with the burnout, with kind of like the feelings of alienation and I don't know, the toxicity I think that exists in our relationships with each other. And I know it's been difficult during the pandemic because we haven't physically been able to be together too much, but really like grounding ourselves and spending the time that it takes to build relationships with people rather than debating people or presuming that we're right and then having to defend ourselves all the time, which I think then turns into a situation where you self-isolate rather than open up into relationality with one another, which we really need more of, right? To build what I hope, I'll see in my lifetime, a true revolutionary movement, which would be really exciting. So sorry, that wasn't a very coherent or like conclusive thing, but you just got to do it. Like there's no way through it but to do it, and it was painful.
Thank you both so much for your answers. So the next question that we have is something you both touched on already in your presentations that I'd love for you to elaborate on, which is, what do frameworks of mutual aid, collective care, and radical relationality imply about our relationship to the state? And on the one hand, I'm interested in how you would respond to critiques that mutual aid is letting the state off the hook, which is a common thing I think we hear. But I'm also really wondering if you can speak to the overlaps between struggles for decolonization and abolition in relation to the demands that can be put on the US settler colonial state versus operating within frameworks of autonomy. And this is a conversation that came up in one of the mutual aid workshop panels this week. This question of demands, like, are these demands of the state symbolic to show the state failings, or can these demands be in service of like taking back institutional resources, not to reform these institutions, but to redistribute them? Yeah.
I'll take this one first since you did the last one. I think I wrote down all the parts of that question. To get about 4 different questions. Question. So if I don't answer a certain part, please remind me. So mutual aid, collective care, radical relationality in relationship to the state seems to be the kind of the overarching, just what is the role of the state, and the visions for liberation that I'm talking about, or that the Red Nation is talking about when it comes to care. Something we talk about in the Red Deal, and you use this phrase, Dean, in your presentation, people power, right? That the normative kind of approach to understanding how you build a movement is you attach it to an elite, an elected official, for example, and the notion that that person might be like our savior, in the halls of power, or that what we're seeking is representation within that kind of class of elites, and that will, transform into something that will really change the lives of millions of people. I would say electoral politics is sort of part of the magic, the magic of that kind of notion of movements. And, we reject that in the Red Deal, I think in a way that probably is very consistent with how Dean described what people power movement-based work means. And for us, that really, like, for example, like AOC, I talked a bit about her in the passages I read. She's an elected official, right? She's kind of an elite at this point. I think that represents an important political movement or a growing tendency or conversation, at least in the United States. Yet she is a product of and accountable to a movement, like a movement that was actively working against the state, right? Because the state was violating treaty rights and violating Indigenous sovereignty, for example, violating sacred sites, trying to pollute the water, right? And so for us, it's not so much about appealing to the state, it's simply about like shifting our focus to movements and building people power, because elected officials will respond to that people power, and usually in unsatisfactory ways, because that's just the nature of their vocation as elites who are part of that class. But that when those concessions do happen, those are victories. Those are sort of temporary victories in those moments. And if they do save the lives of people, like the redistribution of resources, for example, that's beautiful, right? We want more people to be able to live dignified lives, absolutely. But that is not the horizon of our struggle. That's not like where we stop. And in fact, our attention is always turned over here, down and to the left is what we say, with our people. And that the putting our energies into building those movements will always 100% of the time be where our focus is. And so I think maybe some people might call it like a strategic engagement with the state, but not really. It's less like, it's not even really engaging with the state. It's actually making the state respond to you because you have built so much like power as the people that the state cannot look away. The power that you have built, and whatever concessions you get, great. But that like the state isn't going to answer you in a way where like they're going to be like, oh yes, let's end capitalism. Like that's just never going to happen. Yes, let's just give land back to Indigenous people. Like that's seriously not going to happen, except in very small incremental ways. And so this is how we talk about engaging the state. In terms of decolonization and abolition, so we were kind of drawing from the Movement for Black Lives platform, which is incredible. Kind of an abolitionist framework for thinking about how you divest, right, from institutions of harm, carceral institutions, the military, which is the greatest purveyor of violence across the globe, how you divest from that, and then through the mechanisms of the state or through other types of institutions or even movements, you reinvest in, I think we call it the common dignity or the common humanity of all, and also healing the planet. And that it's not that there's a shortage of resources in the world, it's simply that the resources are hoarded by the ruling class at the expense of billions of people, right? And so there is a way in which we can think about strategically engaging the state as a way to like distribute and redistribute resources. But the way to force the state to do that is like not to appeal to the state. I think George Manuel, who's this very important, kind of like the godfather, I would say, of the Indigenous movement in so-called Canada, he was like, we refuse to cry on the shoulder of the man who stole our land any longer. Like we will build our own power and we will go back to our own traditions. And like, this will be the heart of our movements. And I think that how the state responds to that is up to, people in power, but nevertheless, like we will be doing the mutual aid work that will already be about redistributing resources, even though we have far less power and far less resources, than the 1%, than the ruling class does. But being able to do that at the same time that we are issuing demands, because for me, when I think about caretaking, I think about it going on in lots of different scales. And there is a scale, gosh, I always aspire for this scale. We're still trying to work on how to build it. But like the scale of millions, right? Being able to redistribute resources to millions because we want to be able, right, to save the lives and elevate the dignity and just the basic humanity, right, of so many people who are so oppressed and so criminalized, and who face so many different types of premature death because of racial capitalism, and because of settler colonialism. And so how do movements currently today, and I'm not really sure we have movements, do the different like sections that are the constellation of forces that are working, I think, to try to build a movement together, do we have the capacity to save the lives of that many people without the state? I think it's just an honest question, and nobody agrees about it, but I think this is a question we need to be engaging honestly. So again, open-ended things, but that's because I very much think through these and I don't have like a settled kind of approach to it.
That was like so much fun to listen to and so affirming just to hear. Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo, like the way I think about this is like the reason people power is so important is because our opponents have all the money and the guns. Like we can't win at that. We can't be like, well, if we just asked a few more rich people to donate. I mean, like, this is just not, right? So if they have all the money and the guns, all we have is everyone in the world, except for 1%, is like losing at this. Like this is bad news. And actually, it's actually bad for them too, because it's like destroying the possibility of our existence. So it feels like it's a really different framework, again, about just basically how change happens. It's like, do we need to all become like, do we all need to all run for office? And do we need like that kind of move that we need to like take over the elite institutions and become them? I also think we like seen like a lot of decades of people trying that and like really bad outcomes. Like I think that's the other piece of this is people taking over states and then having it be the same type of authoritarian power in slightly different hands, but still ultimately like the former colonizer still running it or whatever. So I think the other thing is about this, that just to echo Melanie, is that when we do build people power, there are government responses and concessions, and they're always as little as they can get away with giving to look like they've done something, like, terrible, meaningless police reforms. We're going to ban these chokeholds or whatever, we're going to train the cops, like as little as they can get away with giving to say they've done something and to say that they are the solution. And so the counter to that is be like, nothing they do is the solution. We see their concessions as an indicator of the power we are building, and we continue to fight. So how to also untrain ourselves from the common belief that, well, they passed a law, so all's good now. Those are demobilizing moves on the part of our opponents. I think that, for me, abolition is like a central space of learning to think this stuff through, because our goal as abolitionists is to refuse the reforms that were offered. They always want to build and perfect policing, imprisonment, the border, whatever. And so we're always saying like, nope, our only goal here is to keep shrinking and dismantling, and building what we know actually makes our communities safe, which will never be a cage or a cop. And that is, that orientation for me works to think about other things too. I think we're in a really interesting moment right now around the defund work, the work to defund police in our cities. And the way that looks, I'm following that closely and participating in Seattle. And the way that looks, it's a big experiment, right? Because if we're trying to like take the police budgets, which are like pretty much half of all of our city and county budgets, and say like, no, we refuse to have this be what half of the city and county budgets are. And we're like, give us childcare and healthcare and housing and things people actually want instead. And some people are trying to do participatory budgeting processes. So it's a real experiment with like getting our hands pretty dirty in city and county councils. I do believe that the most change we can make is always at the most local level. So I think that's much more interesting than trying to make something happen with the Biden administration. It's just like that turn towards the elite, that turn up into the right, to the opposite of what Melanie's saying, is the common move of like, that's where change is. It's up there with those people. And so it's doing something very local is very different than that. But that work is inevitably what we're going to stumble across, is like, even if we get them to fund some housing, sketchy nonprofits are going to make away with half the money. It's going to go to pay EDs. They're going to exclude people who are current drug users. It's going to have all the same problems as the poor relief problems I mentioned earlier. It's still way better than them funding the cops. It's still the first time we've been able to shrink these police budgets that have only grown throughout my entire life. So I think that there's this way in which I really appreciate Melanie's open question. Like, I'm interested in not doing absolutism about any of this. Like, there's people in my Seattle community who are like, I don't fuck with the city council, I'm not touching that. And there's other people who are like, I'm going to go in there and try to figure out as an abolitionist how to like really fight on these budget issues. And I think there's just like a lot of room for both of that. But because all the people are aligned with abolition. None of them are like, oh yeah, banning the chokehold, that'll work. Like, it's once we have that abolitionist discernment together, we can then try to mess with it and be like, well, how far can that part go, without any idea that this city council is going to solve like the white supremacy and colonialism of what Seattle is, and I think that kind of nuance is really missing a lot, especially like in terms of sometimes in social media spaces and elsewhere, where it's like, if you're doing anything different in your tactic than I am, then you're like bad and evil. I think we need a lot more complexity with that. So I'm like, how can we have a relationship to the state that understands it as what it is, a colonial white supremacist thing that's here to extract and destroy us, and like experiment. Like this semester, this like legislative session in Washington, for the first time I did like Washington legislative work, just trying to oppose all bills that expanded criminalization, whether they were brought by Republicans or Democrats. And we did it as like a popular campaign, just like stop passing hate crime laws, stop passing gun laws that are actually going to be used to further imprison youth of color. Like, it was like, we just like got our hands dirty with the Washington legislature, which was like, ugh, but it was an interesting experiment to just be like, could we bring popular power instead of just all these little lobbyists go in and like debate about how to make the law slightly this or slightly that. And it's like, we evaluate that experiment. Was that worth our time? Do we want to do it again? Like, it's just not absolutism. We've got our abolitionist framework against expansion, and then we're going to like try a bunch of stuff and talk to each other a lot so we can evaluate like what's wrong with what we're doing, and just being like humble about that, and also experimental.
Can I add one more thing to that before we move on? I know we're actually approaching time already. I agree 100% with everything Dean just said. And actually, I would say in the history of the Red Nation, the most, I guess you'll call it like success. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but we've been able to get really brilliant concessions at a local level from the city or the state or the tribe or like a municipality or even like a school board, right? And I think there's this idea that in the US particularly, that like we have to automatically go to the national level and the national scale, and we have to appeal Congress and do those kinds of things, that like that's where the real movement happens, and that's like where real change happens. And I think just kind of like dislodging that assumption from our head and really, I mean, actually embracing the diversity of tactics. So you hear this phrase a lot in the movement, diversity of tactics, but like taking on the state in all of these different creative ways is part of that diversity of tactics. So is throwing up a blockade, you know, so is feeding our people. But like that is what our movements already do, but that's what they already require, and not competing with one another or dismissing and canceling one another when we're engaging in a tactic or a political framework that, you know, you might disagree with, but like embracing the diversity in that way, like in that more radical militant way. And one thing I'll say, I don't feel like I really answered the relationship between abolition and decolonization very well. The decolonization piece, I'm a tribal nationalist, okay? Because I know that even though tribal sovereignty, you know, replicates all types of colonial heteropatriarchy and white supremacy in ways, and that just reflects the reality of the fact that we're under occupation by the United States, and it's difficult to undo hegemony in that way, right? Native people also participate in these projects and these ideologies, but nevertheless, like Native nations are colonized. Like we literally don't have our land, like our treaties are constantly being violated. So what if Native nations were to just turn away from the US and actually assert true autonomy? You use the word autonomy, and like appealing to and working with tribal governments and also grassroots movements that have it very like a lot of political influence in tribal politics as a form of decolonization, as a form of asserting Indigenous autonomy and nationhood and sovereignty, but aligned with a very different political project run, right? A political project that is aligned with abolition and that is really invested, right, in decarceration and reducing harm. And so thinking about like Navajo Nation becoming a sanctuary nation, for example, would be a type of that, something I've talked about before, or the Navajo Nation aligning with the Palestinian liberation struggle instead of replicating, you know, like Zionist white supremacy against Palestinian people, like those types of things. Because just like everything else, like sovereignty, nationhood, and autonomy isn't like a prefabricated thing that's already been decided. It's something that happens through struggle, and like politics emerge from struggle, and they're never complete, right? And so the how we address and relate to the state comes out of struggle, and it will be a continued struggle. There's not just like some sort of like holy grail endpoint and then all of a sudden we're liberated, right? Like I think that's also a common conception that we have in the movement that I just find to be like not true, like empirically not true.
Thank you both for your answers. We have about a little more than 10 minutes left, so I do want to move on to a few questions from the audience that we have in the chat. And the first one says, Melanie and Dean, you both hold faculty positions at universities and are widely published along with being active organizers within movements. I'm curious, and I think a lot of students are navigating this question as well. What do you think or hope that knowledge production within the academy can offer to the larger movement for liberation? And particularly with mutual aid, how does situating it within its long histories and genealogies maybe defend mutual aid efforts from being co-opted by the neoliberal project?
I'll just say, you know, yeah, I think to me, I'll be real that like teaching at a law school is my day job. Like everyone, I mean, everyone who's not incredibly rich needs a day job. So I don't see that as like a particular contribution that's a movement contribution. I try to, it's a great day job in terms of like having more free time than I did when I was a poverty lawyer or whatever. So it allows me to do more movement work. I feel like it's a mixed bag, like what academic knowledge production does. I mean, I think it's like so hard to know. I mean, I have gravitated towards more and more in my life towards trying to like make things that are really readable to a lot of people, just because people read less and have short attention spans. And I've made a lot of videos in recent years just because I'm like aware of that and feel all this urgency about, you know, sharing ideas and circulating ideas that matter to me. And I get a lot out of a lot of academic stuff because I like reading that stuff. So, and I've learned a lot from that. And so I think that there's just like, yeah, I'm really into non-absolutism about like academic forums. I also just think it's useful to like notice that like academia is an industry. It's mostly designed to neutralize and demobilize people who have cool ideas and make them like put them you know, through like a really intense disciplinary process that makes them unlikely to still be organizers and unlikely to communicate in ways that are connected to movements. And so we all have to resist that while if we're trying to like play those roles, or we have to find ways to do both or whatever it is. But just like, yeah, it's definitely not like academia is not like a space of liberation. It's just like another industry that's got all of its same like militaristic, colonial, racist goals. I'm really excited by the kinds of research people have done and are doing about mutual aid. Like for me, it's been vital to my learning. And even like when I was first organizing, the movie Palante Siempre Palante about the Young Lords was like one of the first things that was like a political ed workshop that I was doing in a mutual aid group I was in. I mean, this must have been like 2002. And we watched it together, and it helped us theorize what we were doing and understand why our direct mutual aid with, you know, low-income trans people was related to our like anti-colonial, anti-military goals. So I think that like every form in which people are doing research and sharing mutual aid histories and even contemporary stories that are from somewhere else than where you're from or whatever, like it's so helpful. And I'm really grateful to that kind of work in all of its forms, in films and music and poetry and, you know, in like detailed historical accounts. And, you know, I think it's just really, really, really useful. And I'll just say, like, I just recently last semester taught the book Standing with Standing Rock. And one of the most useful things for my class in the book was the descriptions of what the camps were like. What the water protector camps were like, and what it's like to try to create spaces in which people are having a different liberatory social relations. And you hear some of these accounts too about Occupy Wall Street or about various police-free zones. Like, I think that like talking about the kinds of possibility that sometimes emerge in these spaces that are basically just spaces people are taking care of each other is one of the things that I like am really into people doing research about right now that helps us. I think it helps to resist neoliberal co-optation of mutual aid, because it's not like, well, this mutual aid is just so complementary with whatever the state will show up and do. It's like, oh no, this is like a very fangy, like militant project that is suggesting possibility that's far beyond what neoliberalism would allow.
Yeah, I want to echo everything Dean just said about both the Academy and mutual aid. I'm incredibly lucky to work in a Native American Studies department at an institution where my field was actually is actually a product of student activism, like militant, like Red Power activism, actually about 50 years ago. And so I work in a department that is a product of that, first of all, at an institution that has a lot of working class Native people who attend the institution and are, you know, exploited actually by the university, as all students are exploited by universities. I hope people realize that universities really make their money off of the backs of students and that tuition. And so there is kind of like a built-in political project, I would say, given the fact that I have a 75% appointment in this department that is almost like anti-institution sometimes, because we are very much in solidarity with our people and our nations in the state of New Mexico, because Native people are quite visible and we're very accountable. Like actually the way that we think about research, the way that we teach, the expectations we have in our departments, I think kind of contradicts the normal culture of the university, which is about depoliticization. It's about defanging movements, as Dean said. That being said, I too also treat the university as my day job. It's a good day job, at least in my department, because I get to mentor and work with brilliant young Native people, first and foremost. And that is like such a gift, I think, to be able to do that. But I also I'm in movement spaces with some of my students, you know, and I'm in movement spaces with some of the Native people at my institution. So I am very fortunate that where I'm at, there's a more fluid relationship, I would say, at least within a smaller kind of enclave or community within the university. But for the most part, knowledge production, academic knowledge production, most of it's like behind a paywall, for example. Most of it is supposed to be directed at other kind of like experts. And I see that replicated in movements sometimes. And I think maybe when academics participate in movements, of which there aren't very many, to be really frank, academics write a lot about movements, but not a whole lot of them participate in movements. That's a lot, that's like an unspoken, that's like harder, frankly. And so the knowledge that's produced about movements, I find to be incorrect sometimes, because it's very difficult to write about movements, whether historically or theoretically, unless you're really actively engaged in it. I think it's the difference that I had to learn from kind of like elders in the movement about what it means to be like a revolutionary and an intellectual versus kind of like a petty bourgeois intellectual who's employed in the academy. There is a real difference in terms of like where your commitments are, and kind of like the position that you're writing from, or teaching from. And so all I'm trying to say is that it is complicated. I do think that knowledge that's produced in the academy has some bearing on movements, but I do think folks should maybe read that stuff with a grain of salt, including the stuff I've written for academic publications, which is totally fine, because we have to do certain things in like certain types of conventions and within certain limitations in order to like get promoted and to keep our job. So I would say that about knowledge production. It's an interesting thing. And in terms of defending mutual aid from like neoliberal co-optation, gosh, I recently read a critique of mutual aid that a lot of mutual aid actually is charity, even though a lot of us are like solidarity, not charity. And I feel like we understand what that means, but it is actually perhaps a little easier to slip into the charity model when you're doing mutual aid. And so a lot of nonprofits do charity, right? Let's just be really honest. Even though they are also using the language of mutual aid, they are serving the people. It's not like they're not serving the people. But I think Dean is right in saying that there's a qualifier attached to it, right? There's kind of like this notion of civility, or like who are the worthy folks, who are the people who are worthy of receiving the charity or the mutual aid. And so I think for us, the way that we have tried our best to push back against that co-optation is that the political education and the politicization that has always been the basis of mutual aid, especially when it's come out of like radical or left spaces, like grassroots spaces historically. And so making sure that, we are doing politicization through the practice, but also the way that we're talking about it, but then also the way that we're actually doing it, that will be able to help us distinguish between when we're seeing charity and when we're seeing solidarity, even though both are calling themselves mutual aid, which especially after the pandemic has been super common. I would say that language has emerged, even though I think that the politics behind people who self-describe as doing mutual aid are super different, right? So I think that's, again, what we have been trying, somewhat unsuccessfully, we've been trying it.
Thank you both. So we have about 1 minute left. I wanted to give you just one more chance to give any closing comments or share any resources. I noticed you're doing that a little bit in the chat. And then we'll have to close it out. Unfortunately, there's so many good questions we didn't get to ask you. But yeah, if you have any last comments, please keep it to just a minute or so.
I'll just say that I think that a lot of people are overwhelmed. They're like, how could we possibly provide for ourselves and each other? The other side has everything. We have nothing. We're passing around $50 in our community between people. And I just think like the other piece of this, it's like we have to tie this to the really bold work to take everything back. Because the reason it feels like we have nothing is because the boot of the state is on everyone's neck, like making you have nothing. I mean, they have to have such an elaborate apparatus of violence to make people live this way. And so we have to have an imagination that can include like getting rid of that. And then the scarcity doesn't feel the same way. And I think that's why I think it's all ramping up. It's ramping up so hardcore right now, like on every front. And we just need to be prepared to do bold action and to like support people who are doing bold action, to like stand behind people who are being criminalized for bold action, and to like refuse to like engage in this like peace policing stuff, and to like, criticize protesters who weren't peaceful enough. I really want to recommend Vicky Osterweil's new book, In Defense of Looting, as one way to read with your friends. It's like a not academic book, and I'll put it in the chat just as a way to talk to each other and think about the role of bold action historically. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. Thanks for everything you shared, Melanie, and thanks to all the organizers.
Yeah, everything Dean said, but also like you said, Dean, like believe we have power. Like it's resistance. I think the notion of resistance is that we're pushing back against something, which we are, right? We're pushing back because we must push back against the incredible violence that is imposed, the boot on our neck, right, that you just described, Dean. But we are also moving towards something. We're also building something, right? So we're pushing back, but we're also turning away and moving in a different direction. And that moving in a different direction means that we must build power, and don't be afraid to be empowered and to build power with other people, right? So it's not just that we are, you know, oppressed by the system, but that we have the power to build the alternative, right? And that we're actively doing that. Mutual aid is about building the alternative, right? It's about building that infrastructure of caretaking that we talk about in the Red Deal. And so that those dual moves, it's important to concentrate on both of those. And that when we get really burnt out from like the pushing back against something, it's such beautiful work to build something, right? And to really be invested in building that and building it with other people. For me, that gives me real materially grounded optimism. And to have that optimism, right? I was taught by older revolutionaries that to be a revolutionary means to have optimism. It's not to be pessimist. What do they call it? Like a pessimism of the intellect, but an optimism of the will. And we really try to embrace that in the Red Nation. And I really encourage people. I know the world sucks. You know, I know it's hard. I know it's hard out there. Like the pandemic hasn't ended, but that optimism of the will is like incredibly powerful. And when we do this in the millions, like that's, you know, that's how we get liberated and that's how we get free. So I just want to encourage everyone to embrace that and remember that inside yourself.
Well, thank you both, Dean and Melanie and Catherine, and I'll pass it to Grace for a final closing comment.
Well, so, you know, the only thing I have to say is wow and thank you. And that was wonderful. So Melanie, Dean, Rosie, Kat, thank you so, so much. And thanks to everyone for attending this fantastic event. You know, have a good weekend. Bye, everyone.